By the time the helicopter lifted Marcus Flynn over the pines, Dalton Reeves was standing beside an idle plow that could have reopened the mountain road in under an hour. 73 families were trapped behind 6-foot drifts. An ambulance sat stranded at the bottom switchback. School buses had already turned around. 2 homes were rationing heating oil, and the one man who had kept Ridge Rest moving through 7 winters had been ordered to do absolutely nothing. 4 days earlier, the HOA had fined him $500 for tire tracks in the snow. Now the only road in or out had disappeared, and the board that punished him was discovering the difference between authority and usefulness.
Dalton was 52, broad-shouldered, weathered by 30 Colorado winters, and built for practical problems. He lived with his wife, Marcy, in Ridge Rest HOA, a mountain neighborhood of 73 homes perched at 9,200 feet above Pinewood Summit. Marcy taught 4th grade. Dalton operated heavy equipment. Their 2 children had long since moved to warmer cities, leaving the couple with a quiet house, a reliable routine, and a life shaped by snowfall reports. Ridge Rest looked postcard perfect from a distance. Elk crossed the tree line at dawn. The stars burned so bright on clear nights they made the snow glow blue. But beauty came with one hard condition: 1 private road, 2.3 miles of steep switchbacks, no county maintenance, and storms that could bury a truck before sunrise. For 7 years, Dalton had cleared that road for free before work. He had the F-450, the 10-foot blade, the insurance, and the skill. Under the old board president, Bill Hicks, that arrangement made sense. Bill believed mountain communities survived only if neighbors protected one another. Then Bill left to care for his wife, and Vivian Ashford Crane took his seat. She arrived with polished manners, rigid rules, a spotless white Lexus, and a dark pink tailored winter coat that looked better suited to a resort brochure than a snow emergency. The atmosphere in Ridge Rest changed almost immediately. Vivian's first mission was to professionalize the neighborhood. It sounded harmless until Dalton realized he was the target. She reframed his free road clearing as an unregulated liability, pushed through a policy banning volunteer equipment work on HOA property, and sent him a glossy cease and desist notice before she had even secured a replacement contractor. Then early January delivered exactly the kind of storm Dalton had always handled before dawn. Snow stacked fast through the night. By morning, the road had vanished under deep powder and wind-packed drifts. Residents started calling. The school bus could not climb the grade. A young family was stuck at the entrance to their driveway. Marcus Flynn, a diabetic in his 70s who depended on regular dialysis, stood facing a wall of white with no way down the mountain. Dalton tried to follow the rule. Then instinct overrode paperwork. He fired up the plow, made one emergency pass, and opened a narrow lane so people could move. 4 days later, a certified envelope landed on his kitchen table. Inside was a $500 fine for unauthorized snow removal, backed by time-stamped photographs of his tire tracks. Someone had watched him help his neighbors and turned that help into evidence. Dalton challenged the fine at an emergency board meeting and brought every document Vivian claimed to care about: his contractor's license, insurance certificate, maintenance logs, and years of fuel receipts showing how much he had personally spent protecting the road. Vivian brushed it aside, announced a new vendor called Cascade Mountain Services, and blocked access to the full contract. That name stayed with him. A public business search explained why. Cascade belonged to Derek Crane, Vivian's 34-year-old nephew, newly relocated, newly registered, and nowhere near qualified for steep mountain plowing. Dalton paid the fine to protect his house from a lien, parked the plow and sent one blunt email to the neighborhood stating that all future snow removal would now be handled by the board's chosen contractor. Then the blizzard arrived. Residents watched Derek show up with a light residential blade that looked absurd against a 2-mile alpine road. He made it only a few hundred yards before the plow snapped against a frozen rut. The truck retreated. The road disappeared again. Within days, Marcus had to be airlifted after a fall and a medical emergency. The school district began assessing access penalties because children could not get out. Families were trapped, frightened, and furious. Vivian responded by blaming Dalton in a community-wide email for refusing to help. That was the moment he stopped seeing incompetence and started seeing a pattern. With Marcy at the kitchen table and former treasurer Gregory Hammond feeding him old records, Dalton started digging. The reserve fund had been cut nearly in half. A company called Mountain Property Consulting was receiving steady monthly payments with no meaningful deliverables. State records tied that company directly to Vivian. Derek's contract looked even worse. Bloated retainers, emergency surcharges, equipment fees, and insurance that excluded roads with grades over 15%. Ridgerest's road exceeded that for long stretches. Vivian had not just overpaid family, she had exposed every homeowner to serious liability. His attorney advised patience. Let her keep talking. Let the next storm expose both the fraud and the consequence in one shot. Then the intimidation started. One night, Dalton found 2 tires on his plow truck slashed. Deputy Martinez arrived in a marked police SUV wearing a winter vest with police clearly visible and filed a report. The next night, Trevor's truck window was smashed. By morning, Rosa Burke's mailbox had been shattered into the snow. Amanda Schuster, the neighbor arranging media contacts, received an anonymous threat warning her to stop asking questions. The forecast then locked on to another major storm. Residents began begging Dalton to step in before it hit. Every instinct told him to clear the road anyway. He held the line, because rescuing Vivian too early would let her keep the title, the money, and the lie.
The storm buried Ridgerest under more than 3 feet in less than 2 days. Cars vanished to their mirrors. Heating oil ran low. Marcus needed dialysis again. Cascade sent excuses instead of equipment. By late afternoon, Vivian finally did what Dalton had known she would do. She asked the one man she had tried to erase to save the community she could not manage. Dalton did not move on desperation alone. He demanded a signed emergency authorization on HOA letterhead, cancellation of the fine, written indemnification, fuel reimbursement, and a public financial review at the next open meeting. Within hours, panic delivered what pride never would. The email arrived with every board signature attached. At dawn, Dalton rolled out. A local TV crew was already waiting at the entrance. Neighbors lined the road in boots and parkas, watching the blade throw white walls into the sunrise. Marcy stood near the first switchback in a dark pink winter jacket. Rosa watched from a dark pink quilted coat beside her walker. Amanda filmed in a dark pink parka as the dead road came back to life. Dalton saved the final stretch for Vivian's house. She stood beside her buried white SUV in a dark pink insulated coat, pale and exhausted. He stepped from the truck with 2 envelopes. One held his invoice, the other held the records. He handed the evidence to the reporter instead of the HOA president. The pages laid out everything: self-payments, family contracts, missing reserves, insurance gaps, and a written admission that the fine had been issued in error. Deputy Martinez stood beside the marked POLI vehicle as the crowd understood exactly who had trapped them. In that instant, Vivian still held the office, but none of the power. The collapse came fast. Within days, 3 board members resigned.
Interim management took over, and a forensic audit confirmed more than $74,000 in improper payments. The HOA filed for restitution, legal fees, and damages. Vivian listed her house, left Colorado before trial, and still ended up with a judgment that followed her. Derek's company folded by summer, and his equipment was auctioned off for a fraction of what the community had paid him. Ridgerest rebuilt quickly once the siphoning stopped. Rosa became president. Trevor took over the finances. Amanda handled records and transparency. Conflict of interest disclosures became mandatory. A medical emergency fund was created after Marcus's airlifts nearly buried him in bills. The board also did something it should have done years earlier. It hired Dalton properly. Fair storm rates, clear insurance, written terms, no politics. With the nepotism gone, dues dropped instead of rising. Dalton donated part of his back pay to the volunteer fire department that had tried to reach the mountain during the worst storm. By the following winter, his truck carried an official contractor logo instead of resentment. The road opened before dawn, the buses ran on time, and coffee waited at the top of the hill instead of certified fines. One petty punishment over tire tracks had exposed an entire machine built on control, greed, and the assumption that useful people would keep accepting abuse. When that machine finally lost access to the man who made the mountain livable, it collapsed under its own weight. If an HOA drives away the one neighbor doing the real work, would anyone watching have stepped in sooner or let the board sit in the snow it created?